State Deputy Leader of Opposition for his speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call Government Leader.
2 points of clash in this debate. Firstly, the non-transient migrants deserve the right to vote. And secondly, how do you protect these non-transient migrants? On this first idea of whether or not they deserve the right to vote, what we heard coming from the other side of the house was very simple. They told us that they heavily resemble citizens, but there are very slight discrepancies, so we probably shouldn't allow them to vote. Firstly, we would like to contend that arguing that migrants are different simply implies that citizens and migrants do not deserve equal rights. So assuming but not conceding that this is true, that there are indeed differences, then this argument does not engage with the proposition's stance because we're not extending full rights to migrants. For example, we're not giving them a passport because, and this passport is particularly important because of the diplomatic and immigration benefits of actually having that blue passport. We do not give them equal benefits, but we are giving them a vote. So if Alvin wants to talk about proportionality, then we contend that this is likely to be proportionality. But let's contend with their differences of a citizen and a migrant. First of all, they say that these migrants have a utilitarian calculus. It's a short-term calculus that is self-serving. We have several responses. Firstly, this is not true. If migrants obviously live in the state for 20 years, then they obviously have long-term interests that are not necessarily short-term. And when we raised up the POI, Alvin just brushed it off and said we have other parts of the argument. So I'm going to respond to those other parts of the argument. Secondly, what is really wrong with having a short-term utilitarian calculus? Because we contend that it's even better to have a short-term utilitarian calculus in comparison to the huge chunk of voters that do not contribute to the state at all. So we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that having utilitarian calculus is not necessarily wrong. But moreover, they raised to us this idea about how there are migrants that opt out of citizenship when they're offered. And that indicates that there is a duality of interest. We question, what is so wrong with the duality of interest, and what is so wrong with opting out of citizenship? If you give these people the right to vote, will they say, hey, it's time to screw over the United States of America because we now have votes? That really makes no sense, ladies and gentlemen. Just because there is a duality of interest does not mean that the harms will necessarily be consummated. And even if there is a duality of interest, that simply implies that there is also interest to live within the residing state and make sure that everything that is happening there is fine and dandy. We think, ladies and gentlemen, we allow these people to be permanent residents. We allow their children to play with our children. We allow their children to be sent to our schools. All of that indicates is that even if they are not fully loyal, even if they have not raised their right hand and made an oath of allegiance to the state, we still trust them enough to live within our state. We still trust them enough to make decisions for our state. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that all of these differences are just really nitpicking and trying to pick at hairs in this particular debate, and we don't really think that these are valid reasons to deny them a vote. Moreover, they told us in Alvin's second argument that the extent of the interest of the citizens in their country is not the same as the interest of these migrants in the state. Firstly, there is an illusory characterization of a citizen, which implies that if you are less than ideal, you ought to be denied the right to vote. And these are all the examples that came from Job, which they didn't respond to. What if you don't have a job? What if you're just living off welfare? By their logic, because you are not an ideal citizen, because you are not patriotic, you do not have the right to vote. It is fundamentally anti-democratic. And if you say, you need a substantive argument in order to justify that, which I don't think you can technically do an opposition with. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that this argument is fundamentally democratic and it sets the wrong standard for when to vote. Because the wrong thing that they've been doing in this particular debate is because they've consistently been measuring rights as being an ideal citizen. That the only point at which you deserve rights is if you love your country so much that you will be willing to die for them. But what about everybody else who doesn't want to die for the United States of America? Do they deserve to be less humane? Do they deserve to be treated as less people just on the basis of their absence of patriotism? And this is where Job's argument was particularly important in this debate, because Job told us that there is a distinct and discrete difference between having the right to vote and between being nationalistic. That was Job's second argument, which they didn't respond to until this particular point in the debate. No, thank you. This means sit down. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, overall, they haven't really proven to us or showed to us a very compelling reason as to why these credible individuals who are able to migrate into your state do not deserve the right to vote. They are not evil. They sacrifice a lot in order to be in your state. They want the state to work because they will be there. They use it as an economic resource in order to give to their families in the third world. So we contend that it's not in their interest to screw over your state. You're going to be very safe even if you give these people the right to vote. What is the second question? How do you protect these non-transient migrants? What we heard coming from Joe is that when people don't have the right to vote, you make them invisible. This is a thing that we've seen with women, with African Americans, with practically every single minority in the history of man. What they said, coming from Kelvin, was, hey, you know, it's not really that bad because we protect skilled lawyers. Firstly, we think that migrants do always exist on a spectrum and not everybody is a skilled lawyer. Secondly, this contradicts Alvin's characterization about xenophobia. Because if they are xenophobic, then they're likely to protect none of these migrants. But even if they are able to protect skilled lawyers, it's very convenient how they left out talking about these domestic helpers, these people who happen to not be skilled lawyers and who do not really have all the protection available to them in the status quo. So they clearly are not doing anything about them. But before I finish,
the test for the right to vote is not the ideal citizen you talk about, but a reliable citizen. So tell me, how does a citizen with a duality of interest is going to be relied upon when your country is facing a time of crisis or a time of war? Answer the question.
Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that they still can be relied on the average, more than every other citizen in the state. Because we think that if you're comparing somebody to a bum and to a migrant who is actually being a very, very skilled lawyer, it's very difficult to make the case that the bum deserves to vote, but this very, very skilled lawyer doesn't, because he is maligned and he's evil and he doesn't love the state at all. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this doesn't really make any sense. But let's go back onto this issue of how do you really protect them. What we heard coming from Joe is that you change the political calculus about how people make decisions. You're going to want to make these politicians think more about the welfare of these people. Because the last thing they said is that it feeds into xenophobia. But we question, why is it good for the state to validate this irrational behavior by saying that these people are indeed lower class citizens, that these people do not deserve a vote? If there is xenophobia, we contend, how do we best defend against that? We best defend against that when you have politicians in the legislature who want to protect these people even more. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that firstly, nationalism is a fundamentally arbitrary standard that shouldn't be determining anything. That was Job's argument in this particular debate. But moreover, we think that they haven't proven to us a compelling harm of making that skilled lawyer or a domestic helper actually vote in your particular state, because they are living there. They have no interest in making your economy crash. For all these reasons, we're very, very proud of this.
Take government whip, to continue the debate, we'd like to call opposition.
We think that it's telling when the team on side government changes characterization of the goalposts of the debate. Where we start talking, when Job starts talking about the highly educated populace of migrants who then stay for 4 years, because under that paradigm, most of the time, only those get the green cards or get to stay in places like Singapore. Your FDWs, your construction workers, are considered transient workers. This is why a great deal of Alan's argument simply does not actually apply to this debate. So we're not talking about FDWs in today's debate. We are not talking about construction workers, because they are not considered transient workers, and that's how we're going to deal later on with the whole issue of they need the vote. Let's ask 3 questions to today's debate. Do they deserve the vote? Do they need the vote? Does society need them to vote? First question, do they deserve vote? They've come in here and they said, look, they bring in economic services and they are vital to our economy, therefore, and they make these huge sacrifices to move. That's why they deserve the vote. We say, firstly, we don't think their argument that simply because it's an arbitrary birth lottery makes sense. That line where 4 years is similarly arbitrary. It's drawing a random line in the sand. Why don't you give it to 1 year, or 2 years, or to 10 years, or to 20 years? So simply asserting that the birth lottery is arbitrary is, a big issue. We don't think, in this particular case, we think it's precisely because the birth lottery is arbitrary, which is why we need to protect citizens. Because it's very hard, ignore Alvin's analysis, it is very hard for individuals to opt out of the system. Because you are forced to take on national obligations, you are forced to make big sacrifices because you happen to be born in that state. We think in those situations, we should give you special privileges. Then we see them contradict themselves. Because now they say that it's not the same as citizens. Look, we're not giving them the random passport, the piece of paper. We're not giving them the same benefits, but we are giving them the right to vote. But so to them, they are not the same as citizens. We think that's a fundamental contradiction, because now we're not treating them the same as citizens. Because the first speaker talked about how we need equivalency, but we're not treating them equivalent, and we think that they conceded that principle itself, that we don't have to treat them equivalent in an equivalent fashion. But let's go to the second the question then. We think that they get benefits already. Analysis brought up by Alvin and Kelvin. The fact that, for example, they get preferential tax treatment, the fact that they benefit, for example, from the economic infrastructure that places like Singapore have spent a lot of money to maintain, and the fact that, for example, we maintain good laws that may not be existent within their sending country. We also think that they benefit in terms of the jobs that they can get. They say, oh, look, they come and perform important economic services. We think it's a two-way kind of relationship. They benefit from coming to our state as well, and they make the active choice to do so. They make the active choice to come into our country and to settle down. They also make the active choice, in fact, something they conveniently forgot to engage with. They may also make the active choice to opt out of citizenship, to say, yes, let me hold on to my previous citizenship because I don't want to opt in, even though, because they stayed for that many years, because they are considered non-transient, because they often have permanent residency. When they opt out, they are actively saying, look, I don't want to vote. I want to hold on to my previous citizenship. We think that they cast doubt on their loyalties. We think that when you want to ensure that you have an exit plan, we think that's difficult. When all of a sudden, for example, if for example, my colleague suddenly says, oh look, if the going gets tough, I may decide to go back home and I will bring all my money with me and I'll bring all my skills too. We think, therefore, giving them the right to vote doesn't show necessarily that they are going to be reliable in that sense. Because they obviously have trying to straddle two sides. We don't think that that's the kind of citizen that we want. Why? Because they come up here and say, look, it's not that bad to a dual conflict. We said, yes, there are many times when these do manifest themselves hugely. For example, imagine in the case of the Petrobangla situation, where Malaysia and Singapore competing over territorial dispute. If we, for example, do that to a referendum, would you trust a Singaporean voting for it, a Malaysian soil state? We won't trust a Malaysian voting for the Singapore issue. We think that in those situations, it does manifest itself when there are things like, for example, competing territorial claims, whether that be in South Korea and Japan with the Toshima island dispute. We think in those situations, it does manifest itself, but also manifests itself in times of conflict, the fact that we force these obligations. We think a lot of, for example, PRs in Singapore choose to give up their PR because they have to serve national service. We don't think that's fair in that case. Let's ask the second question. Do they need the vote? Because they come up here and say they're abused. We came up here, and I pointed, and I think that Alvin pointed this out very clearly. We aren't talking about the transient workers. We aren't talking about the foreign domestic workers. As much as we are sympathetic to their cause, I am, for one person, very sympathetic to the cause. This is not the debate. Because what we are talking about is we are talking about the educated workers. Let's deal with Job's characterization, that necessarily they provide so many economic benefits, because we don't think it's inconsistent. We think the state now, Kelvin's analysis, right? We have a natural incentive to ensure that these people contribute so much to our society, stay, that they have an incentive to stay. Why on earth would we abuse people when we want them to stay, when we get so many benefits from them coming to our country? We think that in those situations, their harms don't exist. But yes, well,
if your standard is having an exit plan because they have divided interests, why don't you preclude every rich American who's able to get out of the country in case of an economic crisis?
Because, for example, when you want to leave your country, you necessarily, for example, have to pay an exit tax. That's what Eduardo Severin wanted to do, for example. We make it extremely onerous for you to exit your country. That's what we do all the time. The state makes it extremely onerous. You also, for example, have to leave your roots and all these things as well. We think it is extremely onerous for these citizens. Besides, when you are a non-citizen, it's a lot easier to go back because maybe even though you stay for 20 years, you still have family back at home. You still speak the language. We don't think you completely have to uproot yourself under their paradigm. Let's go back to the issue of do they need to vote. Because let's talk about the educated people and how we already have a natural disincentive to ensure that they are not abused. What we also think, the question of does society need them to vote? Because they come up here and they said somehow giving them the vote will moderate xenophobia. Firstly, absolutely no analysis, just simply an assertion that somehow there's this magical link between the two. We don't think so. And the kind of analysis coming up from Alvin never ever dealt with. The fact that what we do now is there's already in many of these countries, precisely for example, the analysis that they had that's very hard for Filipinos or for foreigners to get visas into the US. Precisely in that kind of xenophobic climate, now what we're doing is we're worsening it. Because what we're saying is, what you hold as sacred to you as a citizen, now we're giving it to everybody without having to make to hold on to the obligations that we foist upon you because you were born in our country. We think that worsens the kind of xenophobic rhetoric. We don't think that helps the kind of integration because of precisely kind of Alvin's impacts that they talk about never really dealt with. The fact that, for example, you belittle the sacrifice that non-citizens make when they choose to become citizens, the fact that you belittle citizens themselves when they are forced to take on certain responsibilities. Ultimately, we don't think they solve the problem, we don't think they won the debate.
Take opposition whip for a speech to end the debate for opposition. We qualify speaker of opposition.
Three questions to tell you why side opposition clearly won this debate. Firstly, do they deserve the vote? Secondly, do they need the vote? Thirdly, what happens to them when they are allowed to vote? Something different from Rebecca. First, do they deserve the vote? Well, she's pretty good in her labeling, that's why I use it. What? Do they deserve to vote? And this is where I think we were pretty clear. Because as a matter of principle, I spent roughly 5 minutes in my speech to tell you why that's so fundamentally different from the kind of principal obligations that the state owes to these kind of permanent residents or non-transient migrant workers. We think that when you're talking about the government's obligation, you need to weigh that obligation in terms of incentivizing economic merit and contributions vis-a-vis the kind of protections and status that we accord to citizens on a different plane. And we say that the balance can be struck in terms of the difference in the kind of privileges we extend to migrant workers and citizens alike. We told you that PRs and non-transient migrant workers are important because of the level of commitment that they've made, but they're not equal to citizens because of the extent of commitment. And we think the only real analysis and engagement came only in Alan's speech when he told you what exactly is wrong with short-term utilitarian calculus. And we say nothing. As long as you're a migrant worker, because the short-term utilitarian calculus is very good in terms of economic interest and economic investment. But we're talking about other more non-tangible and non-economic considerations, such as the loyalty to your state, your ability to invoke a sense of commitment to a state in crisis. We don't think the short-term utilitarian calculuses are enough to garner and to justify the vote being committed. Simple enough. The only thing that they tried to push back was that, oh, your standard is kind of unfair because now you're talking about an ideal citizen versus ideal citizen standard. And we said, no, our standard hasn't been about whether or not you're perfect, but whether or not you can be counted on, a reliable citizen's test. And they tried to give us this very weird paradox. Are you willing to prefer the bum on the street than your average white-collar migrant worker? My answer is this. Yes, because in the times of crisis, when I have to go to war, I would rather rely on the bum on the street who is still considering himself an American or a Singaporean to serve his country than the white-collar worker who can easily escape back to his home country. The idea of duality of interest and why they can't be dependent upon. We don't think they've ever, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, dealt with the argument. So no, we recognize that you are important, you contribute a lot. Unfortunately, you do not deserve the vote because the vote is a privilege exclusive to citizens that we can rely upon. Second thing, do they need the vote? And this is where they talked about protection from abuse. And I think this was already preempted in my speech and further driven in Calvin's speech. We said firstly, under status quo, you have existing labor laws to talk about the kind of schizophrenic case that Alan wants to introduce of blue-collar workers within the status quo. If you're talking about exploitation and labor conditions, existing laws deal with it. But if you're talking about Job's analysis, shifting back to the original goalpost, then we think even then, we extend sufficient privileges in Calvin's speech. Subsidies for housing, subsidies for tax exemptions, so on and so forth, because it is in the incentive of these states to give up these kind of incentives. And this is something that Alan didn't once deal with. Listen, check your notes, he didn't deal with the argument. So yes, we take this argument again. More importantly, when we're talking about actualization, we grant you further avenues for actualization because of the merit of Calvin's argument, again dropped in Alan's speech. Third thing, what happens when they're allowed to vote? And this is where my first argument became strawman by Alan in his whip. Because we said that look, what you do is you feed xenophobia. Never mind that Peterson didn't want to deal with it, but don't strawman our argument. Because we said even if xenophobia currently exists, you give greater excuse for xenophobia to be inflamed and exaggerated, right? Because now you feed the perception amongst the people that the government is pandering to the government. The only thing that Alan said was, then why should the government validate xenophobia? Who in the hell is validating xenophobia? We think that xenophobia is morally abhorrent, and yes, we need to deal with it. All we are saying is that we shouldn't encourage it, we shouldn't expand it, because that's exactly what your policy does. And more importantly, they completely drop my second impact, which is the idea that you further undermine integration and acceptance, especially if you're talking about permanent residents, who ultimately in the long run perhaps decide to take up citizenship and forsake the duality of interest. By that point in time, under their paradigm, if Rebecca decides to become a Singapore citizen, then it's very easy for Neha or Danny or Andre to just say, it's no big deal. Because ultimately, you're given the right to vote under the status quo anyway. And we don't want that. We want to recognize and confer recognition and award to her sacrifice for opting into our society, for opting into our interests. For those reasons, we are going to see you in the finals.
We take reply, Speaker of Opposition. To end the debate, we call reply, Speaker of Government.
You become a full citizen of America when you go to the judge, raise your right hand, make that oath, memorize the anthem. And at that point, you are now worthy of a vote, but prior to that point, you are worthy of nothing. This is the policy that they want. The idea, Mr. Speaker, that the sacrifice that people who become citizens make is that 5 minutes. Is this something that is justified, and is this something that is legitimate? When we've told you so many arguments as to why these people give as much to the state, are as accountable to every other person in the state, and are in fact even more worthy than most people in that state. For them to overblow this entire idea that, well, why didn't he opt in, serves as a grave misrepresentation of the interests of these people and does not tackle the real analysis as to why they deserve the right to vote and why they are just as reliable as every other citizen. We need to look at a number of things in this debate, and I don't want to make a rebuttal speech, not like the previous reply speaker, because we know that when that happens, that is when we recognize that they are being very desperate. Firstly, let's talk about this idea that they're trying to make towards the latter half of the debate, that what we did was shift the debate from a debate about highly educated workers versus domesticated workers, versus domestic workers. I don't think, Mr. Speaker, this is an either-or debate, right? The quality of debate worsens when you try to limit it into one definition. The reality is, there are highly educated workers, there are domestic workers, and there are some highly educated workers that become domestic workers. Our policy works for all these individuals regardless of where you come from and regardless of what rights you're receiving now. What did they say? Well, we protect the people who are highly educated. Well, what about the people who are not highly educated? What about the people that the state doesn't want to become citizens? And what about the people who try to become citizens but are constantly being denied the right to citizenship? This is where they fundamentally fail in proving the burden, Mr. Speaker, that even if this was the case, why can't we give them that right to vote? Because that's the second question we ask in this debate. What is the fundamental harm in giving them the right to vote? We told you, Mr. Speaker, that these individuals live there for a long time. They have lived there in a long time and will continue to live there for a long time. They are accountable to their vote, they are fully aware of what's going on, and it's very difficult for them to go home. We give you an analysis, Mr. Speaker, that many of them don't go home, not only by choice, but many of them can't go home, like they don't have the money to go home, or all their money is being sent back home. In this instance, what makes them so different from Bill Gates or every other billionaire, Mr. Speaker, who could leave at any point in time or seek another form of refuge or citizenship? This was another arbitrary line, Mr. Speaker, to which we think they have not established a good case. Why did they do this, and why did this become the end of the debate? It was because, Mr. Speaker, they refused to engage the idea that they're setting super high standards for people to get the right to vote. First of all, we already established to you that giving them the right to vote is not necessarily the same as giving them citizenship. So even using the same standards for citizenship is in itself not a right thing. But more importantly, we gave you so many analysis as to why there are so many people who currently live, for example, but fail below the standard or are not of standard, and yet you still give them more rights even than voting. What was their response? No, bombs are more reliable. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because, well, they don't have other interests. Well, maybe that's sometimes a problem. The fact that they don't have interests even for their own state makes us compel and makes us ask ourselves, why do we give them rights to begin with? Their only argument was this, xenophobia, right? They said what your policy does is that it harms them more. If we kept thinking that way when we were thinking about giving rights to women and blacks, like if we gave them more rights, people will harm them more. We think, Mr. Speaker, nobody would have the right to vote. But what our policy does, and we operationalize the idea that when you give them the rights to vote, there's a systemic, legitimate means of protecting these people. What does status quo do? We leave them on their own. We just hope that the things don't get worse. Because their only response was this: if you give them the right to vote, it will get worse. This is a massive assertion which does not weigh to the idea that when politicians want to protect them, they will be protected. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we think this particular side has not been engaging with the entire spectrum of the people who are involved in this debate. And because of this, we're very proud to see Ateneo in the finals. Thank you.